I would like to thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to do this again. As younger men, Buddy and I, as he said, made a lot of these talks. As older men, we don't get as much attention as we might have at one time. We were both rock collectors up until the early 60s. Back in 1960, and I know Cecilia will remember that, and Buddy, they cut a road up to the top of President Street. And it was a good place to go parking with your girlfriend. And if we had ever thought about getting out of the car and looking around, we would have been picking up bullets and artifacts on the ground all the way back to 1960. But at that time, we had other things on our mind. So we stayed in the car and the relics stayed in the ground. Later, Buddy moves to Lee Acres. I don't know if that was his decision or Cecilia's, but it was a great decision on their part. He started finding material because the bulldozers were in there every day knocking off hills, putting in roads, and things were scattered. Wonderful things were scattered everywhere. He made the mistake of telling me about it in 1965. At that time, I had been looking on Kunawa Creek, which was another early Chickasaw village, but I decided maybe I should move up to Lee Acres. So it becomes a real competition between Buddy and myself, along with Charles Hester, Charles Estes, Jack Mitchell, Steve Cook, Gary Carnathan, John Medcalf. There were a lot of guys at that time who were spending all of their free time out looking for artifacts. And we did that through the 60s and the 70s, and we were finding all of this wonderful stuff, but we really didn't know what it was we were finding or how it related to anything. We contacted Ole Miss and Mississippi State to get archaeologists to come look at this. They were not interested. It wasn't old enough. They were interested in things thousands of years old. So we just continued to do what we were doing. In 1978, the Highway Department is building Highway 78, and they've got it designed going right through the middle of the largest of the Chickasaw villages. And we know that. So we tell them, again, we try to get the professionals interested, and all we got was the Highway Department down on our butts because we wouldn't shut up about where they were going to build their highway. So they finally managed to shut us up about 1978. Well, a young man named John Hall came here from Nashville, and his purpose was to find and walk the original Natchez Trace. So he had lots of maps, he did a lot of research, he had great ideas, he had a very poor presentation of those ideas. So he left in 78 and left Buddy with some of his research material and me with some of it. So I'm thinking this, what he was attempting to do is a great idea. So I set up one wall in my house and covered it up with topographical maps that included all of Lee County, most of Pontotoc, some of Chickasaw, and Itawamba County. But you could stand there in that room and look at this wall, and here's all those maps there. Then I went back and got the original survey maps from the 1830s. And I sat there and I transcribed all of that information off of the original survey maps onto the topographical maps. The creeks don't run in the same places today that they did then. They've been channeled to drain the bottoms. I needed to know how they were when the Indians were here. And all that information is on those survey maps. So now I've got all of the information, and you can see how things looked when the Indians were here, and you can see how they look today. Next step, I invited Buddy, Charles Estes, all of the collectors to come in and we took little colored push pins to this map, and we put them on the map. It turned into clusters of pins. Those clusters of pins were villages. We knew they were villages because that's where we're finding the material. Just to read a letter and put a village somewhere doesn't mean much. You really need to put a shovel in the ground, right, Sam? Yes. So we had a tremendous advantage over professional archaeologists because they've got to get permission, they got to get money, and they're going to work on one site. We were working on a large area. Next ideal, well, if we know where these villages are, we should be able to take these old maps and put the names on the villages. Yay, nobody's ever done that. So we start attempting to do that. One of the first things we find out is that one map will have Ackia in this location, and the next map has Ackia in this location. So what's going on? Again, I was thinking like a white man. If you're going to Saltillo, it's in a location and it's going to be there 100 years from now. Saltillo will still be there. Not the case with the Indians. Those village names were really names of clans. If that clan moved from here to here, now the village has moved. Oh, well, that's important. But it also opened up another idea. If we know this village was here up until 1720, what we know about all of the artifacts that we find there is they all date before 1720 because they've left them. Well, that's important. That gives us an idea that we can pick up a scraper or a bead and we know that it dates before 1720. We might not can say it's 1690, but we know it's before 1720. Then the next group of maps, maybe 1736. What we know about the artifacts we find there is that they all date before 1736. So if you go back and pull out the ones that are 1720, what you've got left is artifacts that were in the trade between 1720 and 1736. That's great because if a bead has a particular date on it with the Chickasaws, it will have that same date with the Creeks or the Choctaws. So we have accidentally come up with a dating system for artifacts. And Sam will tell you that's hard to do. Really hard to do. So we ended up with like 4 different categories that we could put artifacts in. Well, nobody had ever done that before. So the result of all of that was this paper that we wrote in 1980. Steve Cook, professional engineer, Julian Riley, a CPA at the time, and Buddy Palmer, a prominent business future politician. Anybody that would like to have a copy of this, feel free to get it. We wrote it in a way to try to make it difficult for collectors to go find these villages and hunt them. And that was kind of hard to do. We also wrote it in a way that did not refer to the artifacts that we found, merely historical descriptions and information. But we were able, and if you get one of these copies and read through it, you'll appreciate it. Most everything we said in 1980 is still true. There's a few things that we have found since then that might change, but most of it is still true. So that gets us to, okay, Battle of Ackia. We've got all this information of artifacts we find, in the late 30s and early 40s, professional archaeologists did excavations at the top of President Street in Tupelo, and they found a fort there. My ex-father-in-law, Tom Fields, told me as a child they used to pick up bullets back there behind the high school, the old high school. They were on the site at the time. They just didn't pull the trigger and say that's it, because they also excavated another site out on the Natchez Trace, which happened to be a village called Chickasaw that had moved from Kunawa Ridge. But it's sitting right there on the Natchez Trace. So wouldn't it be great to just say that's the Battle of Ackia? Now we've got a tourist stop on the trace. So that was what the Natchez Trace and Tupelo all promoted for a long, long time. So even though we had maps of the Battle of Ackia, those maps didn't fit anything that was going on out there on the trace. So it was still a big mystery as to where this is. And I'm sitting there one night looking at this map, and I'm thinking, this shouldn't be difficult. There's several things that we should be looking for. One is a Chickasaw village. We know where all those are. Another is artifacts that date somewhere between 1720 and 1736, particularly some beads similar to these right here. These we call big blues. They were in the trade, and the way I believe they were getting here is from the Natchez. And Buddy mentioned the fight that the French and the Natchez had, and the French were going to exterminate the Natchez, and over a period of several years, a lot of them moved to live with Chickasaw. I found one garbage pit up at Big Town that had 16 Natchez bowls in the same garbage pit in Tupelo, Mississippi. Not Natchez, but up here. So we knew we should be finding some Natchez pottery. We knew we should be finding some big blue beads, and we knew it had to be on a Chickasaw village. And it should be one of the southern villages. So I'm looking at this map, and on the map, there is a direction. This map was drawn by a French engineer, and I'm saying, if he knows where the sun's coming up every morning, he knows where east is. And if he's got that down, he also knows where north and south and west are. So he didn't make a mistake on this map. We are the ones making the mistake, because we've got it turned around trying to make the village up on the trace be accurate. So I turned the map back around to where north was pointing north. Well, all of a sudden everything starts fitting. There was even a small creek that's still in existence today that is running northeast. Well, everybody knows creeks don't run northeast, they run south. This one runs northeast. And if you're riding down Lawndale, right before you get to Ida Street, you cross a little creek, that's it. That creek runs northeast. But when I saw that, I just got cold chills, and I said, oh my God. We've been looking at it all this time. All we had to do was turn the map around. And there it was. So the result of that is this paper. So we went from the maps on the wall to putting names on the villages to finding the Battle of Ackia. Now, it occurred, first contact with the French is like the early 1700s, probably before that, because the French had been providing guns to the northern Indians The northern Indians had been coming here and raiding Chickasaw villages for slaves. There was a slave trade. Some of the first slave trade in the South was right here in Tupelo, Mississippi. The Chickasaws didn't have guns, so they were in a tight spot. Well, the English then, when they found Charlestown in 1680, they immediately start sending traders into this area. One prominent, the first British Indian agent was a man named Thomas Nairn. In 1708, he is with the Chickasaws, and he is at the village of Feliceco. Well, we know where that village is. It's just inside Pontotoc County, it's the most northern village on Coonawa. It was the war village at that time. Thomas Nairn is there, he's sitting under a shade tree and he's writing in his journal. And he says a few important things. One, he talks about 2 portages. Now, a portage is where you get your boat out of the water. If you're traveling up the river, if there's a portage, that's where you stop your boats and get out of the water. He mentions 2, a big portage and a small portage. On the small portage, he says, is 15 miles from where he is sitting. Well, the big portage was on Tombigbee River. Here you got Town Creek coming down, you got Manatee Creek coming down, and you got Tombigbee River. Right below where these 2 come together is a place called Cotton Gin Port. What's important about Cotton Gin Port? Well, there's a road that leads from here to Memphis, Mississippi River. That's important all the way back to the Benton Indians, because they had settled down and they were in the same area that Chickasaws were. If you were going to connect the Mississippi River to the Tombigbee River, you had to come down that road right there. Whatever group of Indians is living and controlling that area is going to be powerful and wealthy Indians. The Bentons were there, the Chickasaws were there. Chickasaws arrived probably around 1200 AD, according to their stories, and I believe those are true. This is the road Bienville would have come in on, but it's possible that he got his boats out of the water right here. This is the small portage. This is the big portage. He's traveling in April and May, and it was a miserable journey for him. He's 50-something years old. He's sitting in a boat and he's getting rained on every day. There's no Holiday Inns to pull into to warm up and get a cup of coffee. There's no McDonald's to stop at and get you something to eat. You know, you're pretty much out there on your own. You better bring a lot of food, and they did bring a lot of food. You had to worry about keeping your powder dry. It was a horrible journey from Mobile all the way up to here for the French. That was just life at that time in America, though. The group Buddy talked about came in on this road right here, and they reached over to Stoker. Buddy found that hand grenade and had it sitting on his desk for years and years and years, and for a long time we thought it was a cannonball. And finally we got to looking at it and how it was made, and we realized that's not a cannonball, that's a hand grenade. That's what the French were carrying to throw over, as he mentioned, throw over the walls. This whole campaign was a disaster from the very start. The French were supposed to send over the King ship loaded with mortar and other items for them to use. It didn't get here on time, so Bienville is delayed leaving Mobile. He had commissioned boats to be built, and they didn't get there on time either. So he's late, and he sends messages to D'Argate, except that it takes 2 months to get a message from Mobile to him. 2 months. We can send the same message now in 2 seconds by punching a button. But to them, 2 months. A lot can happen in 2 months. And D'Argate got his butt stranded out there at a Chickasaw village and no help coming. He had no choice. He had run out of food. It's either turn around and head back to Memphis, or as the Indians advised him to do, attack this small village and steal their food. So that's what they started to do. Didn't work out well for them. They were ambushed, they were defeated, they were either killed or captured, except for two men. And evidently they had skills that were of use to the Chickasaw, so they kept them alive. I think it was their ability to speak several different Indian languages, which was a valuable thing for the Chickasaw. But these 2 men witnessed what happened to the rest of the French. There was about 20 of them captured, and if you go back and read, it says they were burned. And then in one place it says they were thrown into the fire. Our concept of burning was to tie someone to a stake and put brush around him and set him on fire. The Indians had a lot better idea than that. When they were cleaning off to build the truck stop at Belden, it was obviously there was a village there. We found things, but I found one other thing that I'd never seen before. There was an area like that. Each one of those was a pit that had a big fire in it. And all of the branches were still in the pit. They'd turned to charcoal, but you could see how they were piled in there. One part of the narrative says that the French priest, after seeing what was happening, walked into the fire. What the Indians had done was build a big fire here, 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 and here. Now, they're surrounding that, and they bring them a French. It's Saturday night, not much else going on. They bring them a Frenchman out there. You got to walk through that. Well, it's pretty doggone hot inside there. They were about 3 feet apart, just enough room for you to walk through. So you get out on the other side, the Indians are hooping and hollering, and you got to go back through it again. And they keep running you back and forth through that, so finally you end up stepping in one of those things, and you're laying around hollering and screaming, and they whack you in the head, and you're gone. And you pull out another Frenchman, and you do the same thing to him. Now, that may seem a little bad, but that's exactly what the type thing the French had done to the Natchez. They had burned them alive in some of their houses. This was a violent, ugly time. But yes, I found that, and I believe that's where the Frenchmen that had been captured were sent on to the Happy Hunting Ground. And it's under pavement right now back behind that truck stop, which may be a good thing, because sometimes they might want to take that pavement up and excavate this. So Bienville's in a bad spot. He's done told the king he's going to go up there and eliminate the Chickasaws, because the French are blaming the Chickasaws for what happened with the uprising with the Natchez. And it was a good plan. Have one army come from the north and one come from the south. But it was a plan that should have been implemented in September and October. You know, at a time when the fields of corn have come in, you can steal food, it's a dry weather. They did it in the spring, and y'all know what Mississippi is like in the spring. It's gonna rain every day. They were wet, they were soaking wet from the time they left Mobile to the time they got out of the Tombigbee River. No way to dry off. Once they got out, and it's a question. It's always been assumed that they got out right here. But in the spring, the water in Town Creek is high enough that they could have brought their boats up to here. It would save them about 8 or 9 miles of walking. Now, I don't know for sure, but there's a possibility of both. There's a large Indian mound right here. There may possibly be a French fort right there that's never been looked at by anybody. Someday, maybe I'll get around to looking at it. But the French were wanting to attack the Natchez village. The Natchez, big town, is way up here, and the Natchez are living on the east side of big town. They're the ones that the French really wanted to get. But the Choctaw, they wanted the one Ackia down here. And, well, actually it says Chickasaw. Ackia had been a little further south, but they had moved up to the same prairie that Chickasaw was in. So Choctaws are wanting to attack these people because these are the ones that had been giving them a hard time. These are the ones that had been raiding their villages. And I'm going to back up just a minute to cover an important point. The Chickasaws were divided into two groups, the white and the red. And the white had nothing to do with white men. It's kind of like the Republicans and the Democrats. You had the job of the whites was to always argue for a peaceful solution to your problem. The job of the reds was to always argue for a violent solution to the problem. So the two get together and then they work out what they're going to do. There was a dividing line between the reds and the whites. And that dividing line is Kings Creek. Now, if you ever eaten at Danvers, the little creek just on the other side of Danvers is Kings Creek. It flows through South Tupelo. Kings Creek, Elvis Presley played in Kings Creek when he was a kid. But that was the dividing line. Everything north of Kings Creek was the white Indians. Everything south was the red Indians, all the way down to Pontotoc. 1720, the Choctaw and the French attacked the village called Yannica, which is down the trace at Pontotoc. Killed a lot of Chickasaws, burned the village, they abandoned it. The Chickasaws really were not happy about that at all. And they were attacking the Choctaw. The Choctaw didn't have guns up until 1720. Let me back up one more time. When the English got here around 1680, they started providing the Chickasaws with guns. The Chickasaws now become the slavers. They are raiding other Indian villages 300 miles from Tupelo. And they were capturing other Indians, bringing them back to Tupelo and selling them to the English. Thomas Welch was one of the traders that lived with the Chickasaws. He had several half-breed children. He lived as a Chickasaw and he led them on these slavery raids. And they became, the ones living south of Kings Creek became very, very wealthy. all the stuff that you see up here. The ones north of Kings Creek, they are still trading animal skins. So you had two trades going on, one in animal skins, one in people. If you captured a couple of Choctaws, you could get more money for them than you could get for 50 deer skins. Deer skins are hard. You gotta go out and kill that deer, you gotta drag him back to camp, you gotta dress him out, you gotta work on those hides, you gotta use scrapers, and they were turning everything into scrapers. So one part of the Indians gets really wealthy, the other part doesn't. We noted that early on, we just didn't understand why. Why are we finding so much good stuff south of Kings Creek and we finding no good stuff north of Kings Creek for that time period? Anyway, the Choctaws are wanting to get this group of Indians down here. The French are wanting the group up there. So the Choctaw lead them around because the French didn't know where they were going. They came up Coonawa Ridge, which is not a couple of miles that way. When you get to an area that the Chickasaws have purchased, it was the village, John Ray Beasley owned the property. There was a road, and here's another point that nobody's ever picked up before. The Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace was a valuable road if you're connecting the Tennessee River with the Mississippi River. And that was kind of important to the Indians. It ended up being more important to the white man after 1800. The main road for the Indians was the Cotton Gin Port to Memphis, because it connected those two rivers. If you're coming up the Natchez Trace and you get into Pontotoc County, the Natchez Trace splits. Well, the old map showed it splitting, but then it didn't show where it went after it split. Well, part of it went up through Big Town and onto the Tennessee River and on to Nashville. But the other part split and came across Coonawa Ridge to Bissell, if you know where Bissell is. At Bissell, it hits what is now West Main Street. And that's how Bienville came into this battle. It's a long route. And the Choctaws did that on purpose to kind of confuse and get the French to attack the village they wanted to attack. So they're coming in on West Main Street, which is right up here. They would have gone right down this road in front of this park to an area where OK Tire Company is in Tupelo, or Danvers. If you know where Danvers is, and you know where Lawndale is, that road turned south and went right between the old high school and Pierce Street School. And right at the top of that is where the fort for Ackia was. So they came all the way in, down Main Street, turned south. So their attack was from the north also. What made them think they could defeat the Chickasaw, I do not know. They had no mortars, they had no cannon. And the Chickasaws were in a fort, and they've got a little trench dug on the inside so they can lay down and shoot out these holes. I think there was one Indian killed, one, in the whole Battle of Ackia. At the Battle of Okotostoga, there were like 20 Indians killed. But that's only, at best, that's less than 30 Indians lost. And the French lost everything. They lost, in a previous skirmish, they had lost 1,200 pounds of powder. At Okotostoga, they lost 500 pounds of powder, 1,200 pounds of bullets. All of that is available to the Indians when Bienville gets here for Ackia. So it was a total disaster. They had built these big shields, and they had black slaves that were supposed to walk carrying those shields, which were a great protection from arrows, but were worth nothing against bullets. So they're carrying these shields and they're getting shot, so they throw them down and leave. Now the French are just out there in the open, and they got pretty much wiped out. They did not take the same route going back to their boats, and they were in a hurry. They had just got out of those boats 5 days previously, but they were really worried about the water dropping to where they couldn't get their boats out. And they were also worried about the Chickasaws following them, which they did not, but if they had, they would have wiped all of them out. So they had a hard time transporting the wounded. The Indians that were with them didn't want to carry these wounded people. So they were trying to bribe them and pay them to help us carry this stuff, and they finally got back to, well, I think they might have got out of the water here is because they were so worried about the water dropping. If you're over here in the Tombigbee River, you really don't have to have that concern, because there's going to be enough water to get your boats out. If you're way up here on Town Creek, now you got a problem. If the water does drop, you're stranded, and there's no way you're going to survive. They're going to kill all of them. And so when they left up here, rather than going this long way around to get back, they came back through Verona, Brewer, and between Shannon and Nettleton. That was the short route back to their boats. Same roads that Hernando de Soto used when he was here. Exact same roads for the exact same reason. When de Soto showed up, and Buddy told me not to talk about de Soto, that'd be another time. But anyway, when he showed up, he wasn't here on a trading mission. He wasn't hauling goods in here to trade to the Indians. He was on a stealing and killing mission. So he wasn't bringing a lot of goods to trade to the Indians. You're not going to find much of that material from De Soto. What you will find is items that they made to trade to the Indians. And those were pretty simple. You take lengths of chain and you cut them in half. You hammer them down till they got a point on them, and you put a little wooden handle on it. Now you've got an awl that all the Indian women want one of those. Because you can stick that in the fire, heat it up, and just punch a hole in your leather. So much quicker. So the Spanish were making awls to trade to the Indians. The other thing they were doing, they were taking barrel bands, which are going to be 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide metal bands. As these barrels are emptied up, all they've got to do is cut them up into 2-inch sections, hammer the edge over, sharpen it, you've got a scraper. Now, instead of having to use stone scrapers, you've got a metal scraper. That is huge for the Indians. The other thing they were doing, they were taking their copper, and I found a copper plate that had been cut in half, and it's cut with shears. They're cutting pieces out of it, hammering it flat as they could get it, and putting holes in it, and you got something to hang in your ears. Neck bands also, some arm bands. They were making it out of copper. Those are the things you really need to be looking for if you're going to find De Soto. They did not move off and leave a wealth of metal in these burned villages. And I won't say any more about it, okay? You'll have to come up here again, Sam, to get the rest of the story. So, a disaster for the French, a win for the British. The British then turned around after that and just tossed the Chickasaws away. Why? Because now they're bringing in labor for their plantations from Cuba and Africa. They're not needing the Indian slaves that they needed early on. So they didn't really need the Chickasaws anymore. So the Chickasaws were under a lot of pressure now and ended up making moves from the south all the way up to the southern bank of Kings Creek. And there, where the golf course is, where the Buffalo Park is, where the village out on the trace is, all of these southern villages are now lined up on the bank of Kings Creek. Why did they stop there? It's because they are the Reds. We're still south of Kings Creek. You know, we've abandoned all this stuff and we've moved up here to be close to the whites, and we've stayed on the south side. Then around 1745, 1750, they gave it up and moved north of Kings Creek. Now you've got all of the Chickasaws living in this one area up there, which gets known as Big Town or Old Town in some cases. And they all lived up there for about 50 years in this one area. Now, is anybody in here familiar with a creek called 20 Mile Creek? 1, 2, 3, 4. A few of you are. You got any idea how it gets its name, 20 Mile Creek? Raise your hand. Nobody knows. I'm going to tell you. So you can go home with this and then I'll shut up. On the early mounts, this big town that I'm talking about, where all of the Chickasaws were living, they didn't have road markers like we do on the trace out there now that tells you every mile you've gone, but they had to have a way to mark on that map the distance to this village. And I was looking at that one night and I said, well, here's a creek called 5 Mile Creek, and here's a creek called 10 Mile Creek, and here's a creek called 20 Mile Creek. Oh, well, they finally realized what they were doing. They were using those creeks as distance markers to get to Big Town. Because if you get there, there's food and there's shelter and a Holiday Inn, a couple of McDonald's. You're not hungry anymore and you can get dry. So as people remade their maps, they just copied the name of the creek off of the earlier maps. So 20 Mile Creek is still called 20 Mile Creek, over you know where it is, today, because it was used as a marker on those early maps. Okay. I'm gonna give it back to Buddy. If y'all have any questions, well, Buddy, come up here and if they got questions, one of us can answer.
Okay.